Welcome back to Groundbreakers. I am your host, Nick Stilo, and my co-host, Joe Villar.
Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back indeed. When was the last time you guys actually played a record? An actual physical record?
Oh, I can't even remember.
I don't own a record player.
No, I do.
Or records, so I have not played a record in a very long time, probably since elementary school.
No kidding.
Yeah.
If you guys listen to it now, the sound, in my opinion, is just full.
It's analog. It's
Play a Pink Floyd or a Jimi Hendrix or an Eric Clapton, and it just sounds like they're in the room.
well, they are. It's because they are in the room. Every nuance of sound in that room was picked up by that audio recorder. It wasn't digitally suppressed like it is today. So when you had the guitarist Eric Clapton strumming his strings, you felt it.
You felt it.
Yeah. You heard the strum. You heard the pick hit those strings individually, and it was an experience that you can't get in digital audio today.
So I'll tell you guys something. Do you guys like Pink Floyd at all?
I do.
Okay. I recently purchased a record player, a bit more high end, because I really wanted to truly hear it. And I bought a Pink Floyd record. And I got a good system to back that up. Let me tell you something. It almost takes your breath away. I had to sit down and say, I don't remember the last time I heard music like this. There's a surge happening on records now. It's like the new thing. But I would really encourage you guys, you haven't recently, but hear a record. And you'll be saying to yourself, what have I been listening to this entire time? It's all digitally remastered, but missing the feeling.
The soul.
It's like if you listen to James Dean, Bobby Brown, all of those guys, you feel the soul. But now the way it's been digitized, or what we hear on the radio, like Drake, for example, oh my God. It's like you almost feel like you've been cheated out of music. So I would encourage it. You know why I brought it up? Because I like humble beginnings. I like going all the way back and figuring out what we started with to what we have now. There was a time where Old Bronte didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about 430 Essa, the pivotal point where one urban became one urban.
The genesis, where it all began.
The enigma. The way that Old Bronte came after, but not... Like, it superseded what your goals were for 430. Would you say that that's what it is?
100%.
Okay. Why don't you talk to me about 430? Talk to me about that pen and paper moment where you said, okay, Joe, all right, Nick, it's go time. Tell me about that.
Well, Tony Soprano once famously said in one of his episodes that the lowest form of conversation is remember when. But in this particular case, I think that it's a great conversation because it talks about our humble roots and where we started in the industry. One Urban started from a desire to build community plazas. We, as a company, started with a legacy that my father, Dominic, the president of One Urban, started back in the 80s when he started building community plazas in many of the GTA's cities and boroughs. And, we didn't know anything about the residential part of construction and development. And so that was our first idea, was to find a piece of land in the GTA and surrounding areas that made sense for us to build a plaza. But we quickly realized that you could not buy an acre of land in the GTA anymore. Chitka 2015, 2014, when we were looking very intently, and you couldn't buy a 1 acre piece of land anymore and put a single story plaza on it. The numbers just didn't work. It wasn't financeable. It wasn't profitable. And so one day, maybe in another episode, I came into the office here and shared an idea with the partners. So why don't we build housing and we'll build mixed use? The idea was that mixed use was a more vibrant community than just your straight up residential building. Because you had ground for retail, it provided services, it provided meeting place, it provided extended amenities outside of the building for the people in the building to be able to enjoy. So the idea was, let's build ground floor retail that we would keep. And let's build upwards with the airspace in residential units that will condominiumize and will sell. This way, our core business, which was retail, and commercial plazas still remained there, where we were building these retail plazas and keeping them, but we were able to offset the costs of the retail space by selling off the inventory upstairs and selling them to condominium owners and purchasers. And so that was the first idea. And so, I remember hearing things like, hey, but we've never built housing before. And I said that, well, you're right. We've never built housing, but we've built products before. We are in construction. We know how to build these things. We know how to get these things approved. Let's partner with the gold standard of the industry. And I remember having this discussion with our partners and saying, the one way that we can minimize our chances of failure is by partnering with the best consultants out there. So when you're going out for tender and you're going out for a request for proposal from an architect, you're going to get estimates that range from, I'm just shooting numbers out there, but realistic numbers, $250,000 to $1 million. How do you know who the right architect is in that instance, right? You don't know. And so for us, the idea was, okay, we're not necessarily going to go for the cheapest. We're not necessarily going to go for the most expensive. We're going to go for the one that fits the project. And we're going to go for the one that does this day in and day out. So we partnered with BDP Quadrangle. And BDP Quadrangle is a international firm renowned for many of Toronto's landmark condominium projects. And I remember the first time sitting in front of Sheldon Levitt, who is now their chairman. I believe he's their chairman. But he has retired in his role as principal. I remember sitting with him the very, very first time. And, Sheldon's just a great guy and, too kind to be able to say to me that your 4-story building is just too small for me. I think he saw the passion that we had and saw that there was young, ambitious guys that wanted to start this development company and wanted to build something. And our first project was just this little 4-story project. And he gave us a chance. He said, you know what, look, you've got 2 projects on.
Was he on one? Was he on Bourbon with One Urban?
No, Sheldon was not.
Okay.
But Sheldon would be a great person to have on a Bourbon with One Urban episode because he's just got such a wealth of experience in this industry. But, Sheldon gave us a chance. And then through Sheldon, he introduced us to Jablonski. And Jablonski is probably the country's premier structural engineering firm. And from there, we were introduced to somebody else and then somebody else. And they were all the gold standard. And all of these were players that played together often. And so you knew that all the best players, consultants, were working with developers, and they were working with this group of consultants that were, the usual suspects of our industry, then you knew that you were minimizing your chances of failure because the team behind you was a really, really strong team. So, if I were to actually just step back a few months from that, us looking for land, we did the very conservative thing and the very sensible thing and didn't go out and buy the most expensive piece of land that we could buy or we can find. We went in and bought something that we could handle. And that piece of land was in the city of Barrie at the corner of Essa Road and Veterans Drive. And it's known as 430 Essa Road, a 1.7 acre piece of green space that we bought from a gentleman in Barrie by the name of Ravi Narang. May he rest in peace. He's since passed. And we bought that piece of land, and I remember telling people that we bought our first piece of property in Barrie, and everybody was saying, Barrie? Why Barrie? What's Barrie? And I said, Barrie's untouched yet. Just wait. Barrie's untouched. Look at Barrie today. Barrie's booming today. There are a lot of big players in Barrie right now. Treasure Hill, the Gasparis Group, Matamy's up in Barrie. Even Hip Developments is up in Barrie. Smart Centers is up in Barrie. There's a lot of big players that are now moving into Barrie.
But when you did 430, none of these big players were there.
So Barrie has always had big players. The Pratt family has been building in Barrie for over 100 years. They would be your biggest builder in Barrie that has been pumping out units and homes for many, many years and at volumes that would, consider them large scale developers. And, they have quite literally created the standard in Barrie. So, Barrie had a very small handful of developers. Now Barrie has a ton of developers, big, medium-sized guys like us, and even smaller developers that are buying, 2-3 homes side by side, assembling them and building, 20 or 30 townhouses, right? And so, at the time, Barrie was still untouched. And that was the first property that we bought at the corner of 430 Essa Road.
Yeah, and Barrie at the time was accustomed to a certain type of build. And our project was actually relatively new to them. They weren't accustomed to this. So that was a bit of a curve, a challenge.
Are you talking about the architecture, or are you talking
I'm
about
talking about
the method of construction?
I'm talking about the municipality.
Yeah. So, to echo that, we were coming in with a hybrid construction system where our ground floor was cast in place, concrete, and then our second floor residential verticals upwards to the fourth floor was cold form steel framing. And this hybrid system of concrete cast in place with cold form steel framing on top was something that the city of Barrie, the municipality, wasn't used to. That's right. And I remember the hoops that we had to jump through to get them to approve that drawing set and that type of construction, which now I hear precast and these types of systems are being used a lot more widely in the city of Barrie, including our upcoming building at 440 Essa, which is the property next door, which we purchased a year after we purchased the first property.
But let's stop on that beautiful little tidbit of what's to come. Let's now go. 430 is up and running.
So let me get into that. 430 is under construction at this time. We start construction in July of 2020, right at the height of the pandemic, right at the eye of that storm. And being a condo project, seeing the increases that we had in the construction right at the start of construction, because the pandemic had just started and labor prices had started to shoot up already. Contractors were coming back and having to change their pricing, and rightfully so. They needed to cover their costs. If they couldn't afford to do the project, they're not going to do it for free. And we had to eat all that as the developer. We started to think to ourselves, we need to make a change for this next project that we have on the horizon, which was 2475 Old Bronte. At the time was going to be a condo building. In fact, working with Channel 13 Advertising, we had already had a brand kit designed for it. It was going to be called Jolie Condos. Jolie being youthful, being something.
Like that, man.
It was actually a very, very good concept. Real Sammy and Mike Joffrey and Gianluca De Chile. If you guys are listening to this, you guys are fantastic marketers, and that was probably the first time I had ever seen a condo building with branding that was personifying the image of a woman, or the image of the lifestyle of a person. Jolie was intergenerational. Jolie could have been a late teen moving out of her house for the first time, going up to a senior downsizing and bringing her grandkids to the building, and everybody in between. Jolie was this woman, but it wasn't just one woman. It was intergenerational of women, of the type of people that we were attracting to this building as a condominium building. It ended up not happening. We had some issues with the city in getting that approved. Something we've been vocal on in the past, that the heritage component to it, the hydro component to it. There was stumbling blocks that stopped us. Going back to 430, we're now on the start of construction. It's 2020. And we said, we've already taken a hit and we haven't even put a shovel in the ground. Yeah. What are we going to do on this next project?
So before we jump there, why didn't you guys put a full stop on 430 the second you realized that things are going to get worse during the pandemic?
You couldn't. Sales were already in the bag.
The
financing
momentum
was
has
already
started.
in. The train's already moving. You're not stopping that.
Okay. Once it starts going, you just got to go.
You got to go.
Okay.
You got to go and just fight through it for the next 2-3 years, however long it takes you to
2-3 years, we've got 430. It's up. It's beautiful. It's full. People are enjoying it. And now you guys come back to the table and start saying, now, what do we do next?
Old Bronte was originally a condo, like I said a moment ago, and we realized that with condominiums, your revenue is finite. Your revenue is your revenue. Whatever you sold those units for, that's what it is. So if you take hits through construction, it's going to decrease your bottom line, and hopefully it doesn't decrease to the point that you're not making anything and you're just breaking even on the project, because these projects take a heck of a long time to go through from beginning to end. So you obviously want to come out with a profit at the end. And we decided that maybe it's a good time to look at rentals. And I remember clearly coming into this office one day and say, Joe, what do you think if we did rentals at Old Bronte? And what'd you say to me?
I think you're crazy.
Yep. Called me crazy.
So
And
can
he
I
says,
know why? What was your first? Why is that the first thing that you said?
Well, because first of all, it requires a certain amount of capital investment. It's a long-term play as opposed to a short-term play. And it was new to us. We were accustomed to the retail aspect of things, but we were not accustomed to the residential rental market. So for me, going through the challenges that we went through at 430 Essa, the learning curve, the pandemic, rising costs, for me, it was a bit of a wild card.
Because you were more like, let's make stuff, sell stuff, and move on. You
Absolutely.
didn't really want to say, okay, let's get into the rental and then constantly deal with it.
Yeah.
So somehow you came to the, maybe
I'll
that's a good idea.
I'll tell you the moment, and it's because Google listens.
Uh-huh.
And that night, I'm sitting in bed and I'm scrolling social media, as a lot of us do just before going to sleep to kind of numb out our brains. And I see a sponsored ad for a building renting in Oakville, a building by the name of the Taunton by Brant Haven, which was renting in Oakville, and it was their sponsored ad to drive in renters to rent their building. So I took a screen grab and I came into the office the next day, literally the next day. And I walked back into his office and I showed him the screen grab. And he says, what am I looking at? I said, read it. And it says, Oakville's finest luxury rental building. I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was called the Taunton by Brant Haven, and it showed a price per unit starting at, and I think that was your first eyebrow raising moment to, okay, maybe there is a market for this, and maybe we just need to look deeper into this.
Yep.
Because on a financial standpoint,
Yeah.
you now looked at it as, is it financially something that we can take a better look at?
Yeah. Not only that, but I was seeing writing on the wall. At that time, we were seeing that housing prices were outpacing income increases. So the gap between what people could afford and what the actual prices were, that gap was growing. And so in my mind, I felt people still need a place to live. If they can't afford to own, then they're going to be forced to rent. So that's what kind of drove my thinking a little bit differently in that regard.
And then we were introduced to CMHC. Now, shamelessly going to admit that to that point, I didn't even know what CMHC was or that it even existed. Most people today actually don't know what CMHC is. They might hear the term or the acronym,
Sure.
but they don't really know what CMHC is. And CMHC is effectively an insurance company who insures loans for first-time home buyers traditionally. But now CMHC, being a federally run corporation, they change the rules and say, we're going to back rental housing. So they released a program called RCFI, which we've spoken about in past episodes, which has now been replaced by ACLP. But RCFI stood for Rental Construction Financing Initiative. And what it was a program that allowed developers who previously weren't building rental housing to now start building rental housing with some incentives that this federally run corporation was going to back. And the incentives were as follows. Very, very simple. It was lesser equity requirement or capital requirement into the project, financing as high as 100% loan to cost, though to my understanding, I don't think anybody has actually gotten 100%.
I don't think so.
They've gotten close.
I think it's a marketing thing, if you ask me.
I wouldn't speak so negatively about CMHC when we just finished the deal with them, but they had high loan to value, high loan to cost. They had longer amortized terms. So when your traditional building, your traditional commercial asset is being financed over a 30-year period, CMHC with their insurance backing is saying, well, no, we'll actually extend that to 50 years. That's almost double. Those payments are significantly reduced. And then the third part of it was just lower interest costs. So when you couple these together, lower interest, longer amortization, higher loan to cost, that's the perfect storm for a developer to jump full steam ahead and say, okay, let's look into this. So we looked into it. And at the time, it's now 2019, 2020, roughly, when we started to really to have an eye for it. And we realized that this fund was originally $4 billion. And it was released in 2017, but by the time we were looking at it, 2019, 2020, it had already been reduced to $2 billion. Now people say, "Oh, $2 billion, that's still a lot of money." Not in this business. No. $2 billion. Like our new project is $143 million, one project. So if you have 15 projects at $143 million, there's your $2 billion, right? That's only 15 projects across the country.
Yeah,
how many units
nationwide, not just in Ontario.
Not province-wide.
No, that's nationwide.
Across the country.
How many units is that? $2 billion is not creating tens of you're in the thousands of units, but you're not even in the tens of thousands of units. It's still not enough to satisfy even a scratch of the need that we need in this country to satisfy our supply and demand needs. But needless to say, we jumped into it. We started working with M Commercial, Michelle Durand, who we've had on our Groundbreakers podcast.
Well, I am going to say, wait a second. So when was the Let's Do Old Bronte? What time was that? What year was that?
So let's just back up here, because the process to get approved by CMHC in our particular case was something like almost 2 years.
That's right.
Give or take, of actually getting the approval. So when we were introduced to Michelle Durand, who we've had on Bourbon with One Urban in the past.
That's right. He was amazing. Michelle
is amazing. He is probably one of the country's most prolific.
That's right.
Broker of high value deals. I think his average deal is like 75 million, which is no joke.
75 million, his average?
His average.
Jeez.
We were introduced to him by one of his Ontario colleagues. Michelle operates out of Quebec, but we were introduced to him by Matthew Ablican of the Millennials Choice Group. And Matthew was actually very pivotal for us in 430 Essa. He sold 37 of our 71 units. This was one really powerful broker that came in, and we took a chance on each other, and it ended up flourishing, and we've formed a great business and personal relationship from that. And he introduced us to Michelle Durand. Michelle Durand came in and said, "Look, this looks like a project that CMHC might actually want to do." And at that time, he was working with CMHC for 15 years or so. So he had a pretty good relationship with them. So then he had a finger on the pulse of what they're looking for. He walked us through that process. And about 2 years later, it took us about 2 years.
Yeah. Wow. Is that average?
With CMHC, it is.
Maybe
longer
now, maybe?
It's not supposed to be. It's shorter now.
Oh.
It's shorter now. It's not supposed to be that long, but this was a program that a lot of developers were jumping into, and $2 billion that was left. Like I said a moment ago, that maybe covers 15 projects.
There was a bottleneck because CMHC was making some changes to their guidelines, and it would make it a little bit more difficult to qualify. So a whole bunch of guys went in there and put in their applications before the deadline, which created a bottleneck, which now created that delay in us getting.
And even then, we were part of that bottleneck. But we had a really, really good, complete package of a submission. There was a lot of guys that just submitted to submit just so that they can hit the deadline, beat the deadline. But their package really wasn't that comprehensive.
They just wanted to get it in.
They just wanted to get it in. So imagine if you're CMHC, you're going through all of these applications. You've got the good ones and you've got the not so good ones that you still have to sift through them. You have a duty to sift through them. There are formal applications. People have paid a fee, and the fee isn't small to be able to put in an application. So
you have to pay?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Of course, you have to pay. You have to pay their underwriting fee ahead of time. So you have to pay them. I think in our case, it was something like $30,000.
Yeah.
But that's not cheap. That's not cheap.
That's very expensive.
That's $30,000 that you're not guaranteed. You're saying, look, I'm going to spend $30,000, but this is just a crapshoot. I might not.
So if they say,
no, you lost your $30,000.
Remember,
and you also lost a year plus waiting for them to underwrite this, right?
Given that the funding is capped, they have to be diligent as to who they decide.
They got to pick and choose who's worthy of that.
Exactly. The demographics, the area. Does the area really need that type of housing? So
how did you guys navigate? Not to get off story course, but how did you guys navigate that anxiety? Because remember, you're still a startup company in a way where 30,000, I don't care who you are, it's a lot of money.
Of course.
Were you confident in the project that you submitted? That you felt that you were going to be a strong contender?
We were very confident.
We checked off all their boxes.
Every single
we
one.
Actually, we exceeded
Okay.
Yeah,
the
so
boxes that they were asking for.
part of
us.
RCFI, there's several levers, if you want to call them levers, that help you qualify for a project. And you get certain points allocated to each of these levers in the goals of reaching 100 points. And these points are divided up into three main categories. It's affordability. How much of the units are you going to allocate to being affordable housing? And there's different tiers of affordability. You know, the lesser amount of units gets you lesser amount of points. The more amount of affordable units gets you more points. And again, your goal is always to reach that 100 points, but you can't reach a full 100 points out of an individual lever. You have to mix the three. So again, your affordability, how many units are going to be affordable? Your I'm drawing a blank here.
Energy
Sorry.
efficiency?
Energy efficiency. Thank you, sir. Your energy efficiency, how much of your building meets or exceed rather the 2017 National Building Code standard.
Was it a hard thing to reach?
That is a very hard thing to reach, actually. There's a lot of building science that goes into that energy model. I can get into that. And then the third one was adaptability. How many of these units can be adaptable for people with special needs? The entire building needs to be completely accessible by wheelchair. Completely. So anywhere there's stairs, there has to be a complementing ramp.
Really?
100%.
Wow.
Yeah. And that actually even extended into the units. So a lot of our units, not a lot, but a lot of the units in the CMHC program units for the Old Bronte building have an adaptability component where, for instance, if we get a renter that needs assistance getting into their bed, we've made provisions to have additional structural support on the ceiling of their bedroom, plus power to be able to connect a hoist for them to
out of here.
That's part of what we had to do. Some of our units have special cabinetry in the upper cabinets of the kitchens that the entire cabinet will quite literally swing down. So that if you're in a wheelchair,
told you guys this?
This was all part of CMHC's guidelines.
Incredible, because you guys came from a commercial aspect of things.
We had to learn. We had to learn as we went. Again, going back to that first idea of partnering with really good consultants that have been through this time and time again. It's not always the best to go for the cheaper guys just because they could get the job done. If they haven't done it before, you're mixing a recipe for disaster.